Hey, welcome to lesson 2. Today we'll be looking at French Indochina, which was the name given to the French colony in Southeast Asia, picking up where we left at the end of last lesson. Some of the things we'll cover are listed here: a background to the colonization, so how did French influence in these areas increase, the impact of the colonization on the people living there, some of the resistance to the French, and we'll also touch on some of the French people's reasons for colonizing these areas in the first place. Just quickly, even though this is meant to be a double lesson, I will be making this a little bit shorter because I know it's annoying to click through a series of YouTube videos and you've probably got ads popping up and stuff like that. I will also reduce the length of this total lesson because there is another content quiz which you have to do after watching these lessons on YouTube, and that's going to be posted on the Google Classroom as another Google form. Just a reminder that we've already started covering this. This is the PowerPoint slide from last lesson, which basically outlines what French Indochina is. The region that it covered is modern-day Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. And it wasn't until 1887 that the French officially seized control of this region. Even though France only really had control of these areas for about 60 years, which isn't a massively long time in the scheme of things, I just want to point out before we look at some of the historical stuff that France still did have a pretty decent legacy on many aspects of culture, food, architecture within these countries. So I've got a couple included in here. The top one is Vietnamese coffee, which is obviously very delicious. Before the French came to Vietnam and to Cambodia, most people there just drank tea. So this is a legacy of French colonization, as are VDRs, which are made with baguettes. Not many Southeast Asian countries consume bread nearly as much as the Vietnamese do. And finally, some of the architecture still has legacies of French colonial rule. So this is in the southern parts of Vietnam. I think this one's in what is now called Ho Chi Minh City. You can see that this building looks a lot like an old French cathedral. So what were the French doing in that part of the world anyway? Well, as we covered last lesson, the last half of the 1800s is a period in which a lot of big European nations are trying to colonize, build colonies in other parts of the world. And Central and Southeast Asia faces competition from a lot of different European countries who are trying to stake a claim on different lands there so that they can extract wealth, resources, and to basically increase the power of their home nation. Britain was doing very well in this regard. They'd already claimed most of Southeast Asia, especially India, which was a colony which made Britain very wealthy. Britain, as you know, had a massive empire at this time. And the French were really desperate to get a foothold somewhere and to make a claim in this region. And the area that they were particularly interested in was in what later became French Indochina. We'll start off by looking at Cambodia and how Cambodia came to be colonized. So, as you remember from last lesson, Cambodia used to be a really powerful empire. At its height, it was the most powerful empire within the Southeast Asian region. But this didn't remain the case forever. And after some of the heights of the Khmer Empire, like building Angkor Wat, there was a pretty slow and steady decline, where the size of the population waxed and waned, and the neighbours to each side of Cambodia, so Thailand, which was called Siam before, and Vietnam, grew more and more powerful. And in the last couple of hundred years before the French arrived, Cambodia was steadily weakened by its neighbours. Continual attacks, particularly from Siam, ensured that different areas, different territories of Cambodia were continually changing hands. Sometimes Siam would invade and take some land, it might be taken back by Cambodia, and then it would be taken back again by Siam. So really, the nation was besieged on both sides by its stronger and more powerful neighbours. The French were really interested in Cambodia after some of the accounts of Portuguese and French explorers. particularly the explorers who had seen Angkor Wat and who had written about how sophisticated and beautiful it was. They were also very interested in the strategic position of Cambodia geographically, being so close as it was to Vietnam, which they were also interested in, and where it was in relation to China. They saw the situation, they saw the position that Cambodia was in, and they decided that they would try and get Cambodia on side by offering them protection. So in 1863, France offered Cambodia protection from its neighbours, Thailand and Vietnam, but in exchange, Cambodia would have to give them exclusive trading rights and the ability to exploit all of the natural wealth of the kingdom, including their mineral resources, their forests, etc. Obviously, this is a pretty exploitative deal, but Cambodia was pretty weak at the time, so they took this option so that they would be protected from Thailand and Vietnam. So Cambodia became a protectorate of France, meaning that it was protected from its neighbours, but it was also controlled by the French. And in order to control this region, what the French did was they made use of the power structure that was already present in Cambodia. So Cambodia already had an established power structure. It had elites, and at the very top was the king. The French used the king as a figurehead, and they didn't do anything to upset or destroy the nobility who had lived there for generations. What they did was they used the king rather like a puppet to carry out their rules. This worked to a certain extent. A lot of Cambodians did still quickly find out, however, that even though they were protected from their neighbours, they were also reduced to a state of political and economic subordination to France. France had the final say in all of their affairs. A place that was particularly unhappy with this change was Siam, which, as I said, is now known as Thailand. They really opposed French influence over Cambodia, and they weren't appeased for some time. In order to appease Siam, what the French did was they gave some Cambodian lands in the northwest of Cambodia, places like Siem Reap and Battambang, to Thailand. This move was actually very upsetting to the King of Cambodia and the people, but it was done nonetheless. So once they established control of this region, how did the French rule of this area play out? Well, to begin with, the French were actually very disappointed. Soon after they'd established Protectorate in 1863, the French realised that Cambodia's hidden wealth, which all of these explorers had alluded to, was actually not really there. It was just an illusion. Cambodia, compared to some of the other regions they were interested in, specifically Vietnam, did not have as much wealth, had a much smaller population, and was not going to be as lucrative an area to exploit. They were also very disappointed as they hoped to make Cambodia the new Singapore of China, a place where a lot of merchants and industry could flourish, but obviously this hope never came true. What they instead decided to do was to collect wealth through taxation. They did this pretty well. They managed to extract pretty high taxes from the peasantry, from Cambodia's village-based economy. In terms of actually changing the country, though, the French didn't really do much. They didn't modernise it. Life for a lot of people in this nation just continued on in the same way that it previously had. And in many ways it was made worse by the French presence because taxation rates and tax really increased. In fact, the tax burden got so heavy that in 1916, a non-violent tax revolt brought in tens of thousands of peasants into the capital city, Phnom Penh, and they actually petitioned the king for a reduction. That doesn't sound like a really crazy, intense political action, I know, but the incident still did quite shock the French, because the French were very sure in their belief that the Cambodians were really individualistic, really meek, and really lazy. So they had never thought that the Cambodians were really capable of organising a mass protest or voicing discontent with the French rule, but they did. And in fact, taxes continue to be really hated by Cambodians. Another form of tax as well was called the corvée, And basically, that meant conscription for working on government projects without pay. So if a peasant was unable to pay the full amount of tax, they could be forced to work for free, doing hard manual labour for the French administration in Cambodia. Sometimes this could mean 10 hours of digging roads per day, helping build public buildings, or working on a government plantation. That was really, really resented by the peasants. Another thing hated by Cambodian peasants was French moneylenders, who were really unscrupulous and very predatory. They indebted a lot of the population by giving out loans which had really high interest rates, things like 100 and 200%. This meant that a lot of peasants not fully understanding the terms would borrow money from French moneylenders, not be able to pay it back fully in time, and then they'd have interest payments on top of what they owed, which could be so high that they might have to sell their family land. A final source of conflict can be seen in 1884. Cambodia was forced to accept a treaty brought in by the French administration, which included a lot of social changes, which really restructured the way that Cambodian society worked. One of them was a really positive one, the abolition of slavery, that was forbidden. It also introduced some things which were pretty groundbreaking, like institution of private land ownership, so anyone could buy land, it didn't have to be managed by a village or by a family, and the establishment of French communities in capital cities. The king was forced to sign this agreement. He didn't want to. He had little choice though, because French gunships surrounded his royal palace, but the elites were particularly unhappy with it. They raised rebellions across the countryside, which were pretty violent until they were suppressed a year later, and they continued to passively resist these laws by ignoring them or breaking them whenever possible. And I think it is really important to be aware that even in small forms, even at a low level, that there was resistance in Cambodia to some aspects of the French colonial administration. There's a bit of a trend, especially among historians, to say, oh, the Cambodians just readily accepted French domination. They'd been used to continual skirmishes with their neighbours. They were happy to have a powerful protector. And to a certain extent, it is true that they were forced to accept the French as a protector because they were weaker than their neighbours. But things like this demonstrated that they weren't happy to meekly just accept all French rules, especially those which interrupted their traditional way of life. All right, so how was power consolidated? How were the French truly established as rulers of these areas? Well, the first thing they did was they sent local governors, sometimes called residents, to major population centres across the country. They oversaw the management in these specific regions and made local laws. Norodom, the Cambodian king, and his successors still held figurehead roles. They were spiritual leaders of the country, but they didn't actually write and enforce laws. That was the responsibility of the French government. During the 60-year period that France was the protector of Cambodia, the bureaucracy, so the people they used to manage the country, expanded really rapidly. And it was a really sore point of contention for a lot of educated and wealthy Cambodians that the people managing the country were very rarely Cambodian. So the highest positions in the government, in the administration, were given to French nationals, people from France. However, the junior or lower positions, things like clerks and junior employees, these positions were actually given to the Vietnamese people rather than Cambodians. The France sent for people from Vietnam to come over and work for them. And seeing as Vietnam had been a long-standing enemy of Cambodia, you can imagine how insulting this was to some of the Cambodian elite. It also really demonstrates that under France, not many Cambodians were given the opportunity to modernise or to have a real say in how their country was run. It was entirely done by outsiders.